Hi, everyone. It's Rob, and thanks for listening in today. I greatly appreciate your time. As always, my guest today is Dr. Ha Vinh Tho. Dr. Tho is the founder of the Eurasia Foundation and of the Eurasia Learning Institute for Happiness and Wellbeing, the former program director of the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan, the former director of learning and development at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the former director of the Camp Hill Seminar for Curative Education in Switzerland. He holds a PhD in psychology and education from Geneva University. He has studied Eurythmy and curative Eurythmy in Switzerland. He's also a Buddhist teacher in the Vietnamese Zen tradition, ordained by Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. He has designed and written the teacher's training curriculum, Happy Schools, that has been implemented in many schools in Vietnam and in Switzerland. He has designed the Gross National Happiness Program in business that has been implemented in several companies in Thailand, notably B. Grimm, Vietnam, notably Biddies, and Switzerland, notably SIG. He is currently developing a Happy Village project in Vietnam to apply the Gross National Happiness Framework at a local level. He is the organizer and main host of the international symposium Happy School, taking place from April 3rd to April 6th, 2023 in Vietnam. He is an international speaker. Some of his latest appearances are the Global Scientific Conference on Human Flourishing. At the invitation of the mayor of the city of Stuttgart, he spoke to the City Hall. University of Geneva, How to Apply Gross National Happiness in Geneva. Co-Create Humanity, From War Zones to Happiness Country, and the National Conference on Happy Schools in Vietnam with 400 or more school principals from 50 provinces in attendance. Tho has published many articles. He is the author of several books published in Germany, France, Switzerland, and Vietnam. Today, we'll be discussing his book, A Culture of Happiness. And I'm excited to have you hear what Tho has to say about developing a happiness culture in your business, your household, and your community. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Ha Vinh Tho. Tho, welcome to the Leading with Genuine Care podcast. It's so great to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. I'm happy to be here.
You're a return guest, so I'm just so grateful for you taking more time with me to answer more of my questions. There's never enough time to answer all of them, but today I really want to talk about your book, A Culture of Happiness. And I have a lot of, as you can see, I've gone through it extensively numerous times. It is such a wonderful book. And today oftentimes I start with a quote, but today I'd like to start with a poem, and I'd love to get your feedback on the poem. And so it goes like this: the endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness, knowledge of speech, but not of silence, knowledge of words and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. All our ignorance brings us nearer to death, but nearness to death no nearer to God. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And that's a poem from T.S. Eliot, and I scooped that up from your book. And what are your thoughts on that?
First of all, thank you so much for choosing this poem. I really love it. I think it really captures in a very poetic way the kind of challenge that we are facing in a modern society, where we have so much information, we have so much knowledge, we have, so much is available. But then there's the danger that we get lost in superficiality, and that all this knowledge, all this information doesn't really help us to go deeper. So I think, when you look at consciousness, there's a kind of you could imagine it as like two axes. One is like information, and the other one is integration. So horizontal would be like information, and vertical would be integration. And so the danger is that we get so much information that we have very little time to integrate it. Therefore, all the knowledge that we receive that doesn't help to transform us is in a way lost. Mm-hmm. So T.S. Eliot captured that in an amazing way, this kind of tension between knowing and true wisdom, between being and doing, between the external activity and the inner quality of the being. So yeah, thank you for choosing that. I think that's a beautiful quote.
I'm so happy you included it in there. And for those that may not have listened in prior, or it's been a couple of years now, I'd like to start by asking you if you wouldn't mind just taking us a little bit through your upbringing and your life kind of in the early days, and I'll kind of build on some questions from there.
So I was born from a Vietnamese father and a French mother. And when I was born, Vietnam was still a French colony. And so it's part of my history to have been brought up between two cultures, two worlds, and also in this tension between like the dominating French or, Western culture, and then colonized countries like Vietnam in this case. And so that's something that has played quite a big role in my life, to be aware of, I'm not on one side or the other. I'm somehow in between, between the colonized and the colonized, between Europe and Asia, between Buddhism and Christianity, right, and so on. So I think that has really had quite a strong impact on me. And the second aspect that I could mention is that I grew up in the time of the war in Vietnam, which the Americans called the Vietnam War and the Vietnamese called the American War for obvious reasons. Yeah. and that's the other thing that has really colored my upbringing, my youth, that the awareness of war. Although luckily enough, I was not very much exposed to direct, experience of war zones when I was a kid. It happened later. Mm-hmm. But when I was a kid, a young man, I was not exposed to that. But the awareness was there because my family was in the war. We lost relatives in the war. And again, my family was torn between North and South. So again, seeing the two sides and, and not wanting to take side. And yet, if you don't take side, both sides consider you as the enemy.
Did you grow up in Vietnam or did you grow up in France?
Neither, because my father was a diplomat, so we were traveling.
Oh, I see.
I grew up in many different countries, yeah. Mm-hmm. So,
and then you were educated, and you have your PhD in psychology from the University of Geneva. And so, when you went through and decided to do that, what were you thinking your career would be?
Well, actually, I did my PhD very late in life, so it was not at all my first career.
Okay.
My first training, I was a dancer.
Oh, kidding.
Yes. A very specific kind of dance, which is called Eurythmy, which was created by Rudolf Steiner.
Yeah.
And that is used both as a performing art, but also as a therapeutic healing movements, kind of Western yoga, if you want, or Western Tai Chi or something like that. Mm-hmm. So for quite a long time, I was actually working in the field of special education, especially working with children living with disability, mental disability, emotional disability, and so on. And then also training trainers or training teachers and educators. And then I was performing. I was a performing artist, and then I became the director of the college training the special ed teachers. And then I needed to have an academic degree to sort of have the credibility to be the director. And that's when I did my PhD, which was relatively late. I was over 40 already when I did the PhD.
Mm-hmm. And then could you ever have imagined how that initial that dance in the performance would lead you into all these things that you do nowadays? I mean, it's kind of nutty in my mind how it all kind of unfolded.
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously no, because, how can you guess when you're 20 years old, what's going to happen later in life? I mean, life is full of surprises. And even, before going to Bhutan, I never would have dreamt to go to Bhutan. But yes, from the perspective that the question that I was holding from very early on, and again, that's really related to what I described, with war and double culture and so on, was how do I combine my inner spiritual path with social engagement, with being actually socially active. So I had a strong political interest because of the war and so on. I was very active in the peace movement and so on. Mm-hmm. And then when I really discovered or rediscovered Buddhism and the inner path, for me was the question, how can I combine the two? And in a way, studying Eurythmy, which is both an inner path, if you want, a spiritual path through movement, like yoga or Tai Chi could be, but also something that you can actually practice, for instance, as a healing method, was a step towards finding a way to combine the inner and the outer. So in a way, everything that unfolded later was somehow out of this seed, out of this root of how do I combine inner transformation and social political engagement.
Yeah. I think nowadays, especially here in the West, a lot of kids in their 20s, and I have kids in their 20s, and they do feel like they need to take a certain path and it needs to be very direct and check a certain kinds of boxes to get where they see themselves going. And I'm curious, how your path unfolded, if you have any wisdom that you might share with the youth of today.
So when I look at my path from the perspective of my parents, I'm amazed how courageous they were to accept. Because originally I was meant, when I studied Eurythmy, actually I was on my way to university in Strasbourg to study medicine, which was, kind of a decent career. You become a doctor and, it's like, makes sense. And my father—
More of a path.
Yeah, my father was a diplomat, and I come from a family of scholars. It was very understandable. Becoming a medical doctor was like no problem at all, right? Yeah. But then I stopped and I said, no, I won't study medicine. I will become a dancer. So, and my father, had so much trust in me that he said, okay, if you think that's what you need to do, and he actually financed my studies. And looking back, I'm so grateful and so full of admiration that my father, although he really didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing, accepted that. So looking from the perspective of the young people, of course, I would tend to say, follow your heart, because whatever you're going to do, you might do it for a long time, although now people tend to change. But still, in the youth, you give direction to your life. And if the direction is not taken out of an inner aspiration, that's what I want to do in life, that's what I'm committed to, that's what's aligned with my values and my ideals, then work life can become very burdensome. It's okay, I have to go back to office and earn money and whatever, but actually my life starts on Friday evening, and ends on Monday morning. So that's a terrible life, So, yeah. So
there's a term. There's a term that some younger professionals use now, and they call it the Sunday scaries. I don't know if you've heard that. Have you heard that? No. It's the anxiety that begins to build up on Sunday that they're going back to work on Monday. So you made me think about that. I wanted to also mention that you're an ordained lay Buddhist teacher in the Plum Village tradition of Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. And I'm wondering if you can share your experience and how that all happened in your life.
Yes, thank you for asking, because as you probably know, Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh passed away in last year. Yeah. And of course, it's also nice for me to have the opportunity to honor his memory and his presence, really, more than just a memory, by sharing my meeting with him. It was very interesting because I met Buddhism early on in 1970. When I went to Nepal, but it was Tibetan Buddhism, although I come from a Vietnamese family. And then I got also involved in Japanese Zen Buddhism. But I actually had not heard of Thich Nhat Hanh He was not that well known in the 70s. And I had the chance to go back to Vietnam after the war in 1982, so very soon after the war. At that time, the country was just still closed, but because of my family, so I could go to Vietnam. And it was actually some of my relatives who had been Thich Nhat Hanh's students in Vietnam who told me about the fact that Thich Nhat Hanh was in France. So when I came back to Europe, I wrote to him, and then he wrote back and invited me, and then I went to Plum Village. And the first encounter I had was twofold. First, my wife and I arrived for the first time in Plum Village, and right away, Thich Nhat Hanh was called Thai by his students, which means teacher. Thai invited us to have a cup of tea with him, and I thought, like, that's the normal thing to do when you arrive in Plum Village. You go and have a cup of tea. Little did I know, it was quite special. Yeah. And that was because he knew my family, and so anyways, we right away, and that was sort of a very natural. He was such a gentle person, very humble, asking about the family. He was very eager to hear about Vietnam. He had not been in Vietnam since the mid-60s, and I was just coming back, so so it was a very normal, human, friendly conversation. And I was just, very warm-hearted, and I liked him right away. But it was just like meeting a very nice elder man or something. And then the next day or so, he gave the first Dharma talk that I heard, and it was like completely different. Suddenly there was a master there, and his presence was so impressive. And I remember I started crying during the Dharma talk, not because I was sad, but because I was so moved. And I had the feeling, the way I experienced it at that time was that, because I'd been practicing Buddhism for over 10 years, I thought I knew a lot about compassion, and, because it's one of the basics of Buddhism. But when I experienced Thich Nhat Hanh, I realized I didn't know anything about compassion. It was mere intellectual knowledge. And he spoke, and it was embodied compassion. Speaking through the words of wisdom, but what was shining through was incredible, like really a boundless compassion. And I was so touched by that. It was such a deep experience. And this experience remained, and I was a student then from then on until he passed away last year. And each time I met him, I had the same experience, that there was such an authenticity. I saw him in front of thousands of people. I saw him, alone or with just a few people. I saw him with very rich, famous people, and I saw him with little kids. He was exactly the same. He didn't make any difference between people. For him, whoever was in front of him was the most important person. And he would give them his full attention, his full care, his full love. He did whatever he could, but he didn't make any difference between people. And I mean, that's been really a very impressive lesson. And maybe another thing I want to mention is over all these years, I always received really boundless support from him, but he always left me completely free. He never requested anything from me, not materially, not spiritually, nothing. He just, just whatever I was doing, he was supporting it, leaving me completely free. And it reminded me of one of Buddha's quotes that says, the fundamental taste of Dharma is the taste of freedom. When you were with Thai, you felt the taste of freedom.
And for those listening that may not be familiar with the term Dharma, could you explain what that means?
So Dharma is the Buddhist. It has two meanings. On one hand, it means the law of the universe, if you want, right? And then more specifically, it means a Buddha's teaching. So all the teachings that were given by the Buddha and all the masters that follow. So the idea is that authentic Buddhist teaching is always something that leaves you completely free. It's not imposing anything on you. It's not requesting. It's just an offering, and then you can freely choose whatever is helpful for yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So you had a series of experiences that led you, I'm going to jump ahead here, to your time in Bhutan. And can you talk a little bit about how you ended up there and what makes Bhutan different than other places on this earth?
Yeah, so maybe I'll go back a little bit to what I was doing before going to Bhutan. So as I mentioned, I spent a lot of time in my life in working in the social field, training special ed teachers and so on. And then at a certain point, I moved to the humanitarian field, and I worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross, or ICRC. And the International Committee of the Red Cross is the part of the Red Crescent movement that works in war zones. So there's two parts. One is national societies, like you have American Red Cross, and it's basically public health and catastrophe relief and things like that. And then you have the International Committee of Red Cross, which is an organization that is in charge of the humanitarian laws, or the laws of war. So because even in war, there are laws. And when we speak, for instance, now with the war of a crime against humanity or crime against war crimes, it means that the war is conducted in a way that is not respecting international humanitarian law. So I became the director of learning and development of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a large organization with branches in 180 countries and so on. And my job was to train humanitarian workers that would go to conflict zones and war areas. And so I had, of course, myself to go a lot to war zones and conflict areas. And the experience that I had in the war zones was really what led me then later to Bhutan, in the way that I realized that when you are in a war zone, imagine, for instance, going to Ukraine now, for instance, but I went to Afghanistan, I went to Palestine, I went to Ivory Coast, I went to Darfur. I mean, I visited many of the war zones of the 20th century and of the beginning of the 21st century. Sorry, and as you realize, there is a physical violence, like people getting wounded and weapons and so on. But you realize, or I realized, that behind this physical violence, there's structural violence. So it means we have developed systems that lead to violence. And the violence, when it manifests, like in a war, it's like the tip of the iceberg. And when you're a humanitarian worker, you always work with the consequences of these deeper root causes of war, which are ecological destruction, social injustice, things like that. And so the question that really arose in me was, can we work upstream? Before it's manifesting as wars and destruction and bombing and maiming and killing, what would it take to work upstream, to go upstream and to try to transform the root causes of war and destruction? And so that was a question that I lived with very strongly, being exposed very directly to the consequences of wars. And I was, I had ideas on the individual level as a Buddhist practitioner. How do you transform your own aggressivity, fear that leads to violence, right? So it's more the inner dimension, personal dimension. And I was quite aware of that. And I was also aware of the importance of that. But I also knew that if we only look at it at the personal level, it would probably not be enough to transform whole systems. So I was wondering, what are the, how could you transform, or can you bring about this transformation that I knew from the inner world into society? And that's how I came across Bhutan and the idea of gross national happiness. And basically, the fundamental idea is very, very simple. It's just to say, in the recent time, we have been focusing, and this is true worldwide, our attention on economic growth as the most important indicator. So it is as if the goal was economic growth, and all the rest was serving this goal. All the rest is people, nature, society. They are in the service of the economic system. And I realized that in this perspective, there's an innate violence, because in reality, it's the other way around. The highest, the most important is the ecosystem, our planet, right? Because without that, no survival. Mm-hmm. Within this huge ecosystem. One of the subsystem is humankind, because there's not only humans, there are all the rest, animals and plants and oceans and forests and so on, right? So we are one of the subsystems is human. Within this human subsystem, there's one smaller subsystem, which is the economic system. And the economic system is only one of at least 3 different systems, which is like cultural system, political system, and so on. Yeah. And suddenly one part has become the whole. And that's a kind of a social disease. It's almost like cancer cells, right? A small part of the body, which is have a limited function, then start to grow and grow and grow and take over all the rest. And then ultimately, if you can't stop that, you would die, right? And so economic system has become kind of a social cancer. You know, like suddenly humans are less important than profit. So you will fire people, you will, accept social inequality and so on. Nature has become less important than the economy. So you will, like burn forests and destroy the Amazon and pollute oceans because it's just a subsystem of the economy. So the fundamental idea of gross national happiness, which is very simple, is to say in the center of our attention should be happiness of all people and well-being of all life forms. That's all there is to it. And then all the rest falls into place once you put that in the center, and then you realize that the economy, politics, and so on are subsystems that should serve happiness and well-being for all. And that's what Bhutan was the first country to sort of implement. And when I heard about that, I was absolutely thrilled. I thought, yes, that's what I'm looking for. Little did I know that, a few years later, I would go there myself.
Jeez. So I read in the book that the king felt that gross national happiness was more important than gross domestic product. And I'm curious if you can explain the principles around GNH.
Absolutely. So that was the first statement defining GNH, gross national happiness, was the fourth king. He was still a young man. He was not even in his 20s. He was a teenager.
Right? Wow.
Yeah. When he first came up with the idea, and when he said gross national happiness is more important than gross national product, he formulated in one short sentence what I clumsily explain in many sentences, which is to say that the most important thing that any leader, any society, any political system should be looking at is how do we increase happiness and well-being. Mm-hmm. And that's gross domestic product, or gross national product is similar, are just one of the means to this end. The end is happiness and well-being. And gross economic system, like all the other systems, should be serving happiness and well-being. Mm-hmm. And so, it took quite a long time, because it was like a seed that was planted in early 70s, actually, quite a long time ago. And it took until really 2011 before it was really presented at the United Nations. And then it was passed as a resolution at the United Nations. And then some people said, well, it's a very nice idea, but GDP is a measurement tool. And GNH is an ideal. You cannot replace a measurement tool with an idea. You have to replace it with a better measurement tool. Mm-hmm. So that's how the GNH index came about. So how do you measure progress and development, not only based on economic performance, but based on how does it contribute to the well-being of the people? So that's basically what GNH is about. Measuring the development of a country, of a business, of a school, of an organization, of a city, focusing your attention of what is it that brings happiness and well-being.
Mm-hmm. And so in a sense, I'm probably going to oversimplify it, but there's like a scorecard. And the scorecard picks up all these different metrics that you're mentioning. And how are those metrics gathered?
Well, it was quite interesting because there were a lot of then expert meetings and discussion. How are we going to measure that? It's not that easy, because happiness is such a subjective thing. not two people have the same definition of happiness. So how can you measure something that you cannot even define, right? So the first step was coming to a certain understanding of what do we mean by happiness. That was the first step. And so the first step was to realize that when we speak of happiness in the context of gross national happiness, we are not speaking just of pleasurable experiences, of feel good and so on, which is important, but of course that's very subjective. And you don't want your boss or your government to tell you what should make you happy in this sense, or what you like doing or something. That would be terrible. But there's a deeper layer of happiness, which is something more lasting. It's not about feeling happy, it's about being happy. And this being happy, and now we have a lot of research, also scientific research, where we have pretty much a consensus on it, that there are three main components. One component is being aligned with yourself, living in harmony with yourself. So that you feel that your life is a way to express your deepest aspiration, your highest goal, and that you feel there's an alignment between who you are, what you do, what you believe in, and so on. So harmony with oneself, right? That's number one. Number two is living in harmony with others and caring for others. So living in harmony and caring for oneself, living in harmony and caring for others, because we have a lot of research evidence that shows that the quality of human relationship is actually one of the major factors of well-being or ill-being, even as far as illness and life expectancy. It's really amazing. And there was the famous grand study from Harvard University that really showed that very clearly. Mm-hmm. So living in harmony with others. And the third one is living in harmony with nature, with our planet. So these three modes of care, caring for oneself, caring for others, and caring for nature, are what we consider being the fundamental components of, if you want, objective happiness. Mm-hmm. Which doesn't mean that, of course, sometimes you will be sad, sometimes you will be joyous. That's life. And we don't measure that, but we measure whether these fundaments are cared for. And that's how gradually we developed the GNH index, which is a way to measure all the elements that contribute to these three modes of care. That includes things like health and education and psychological well-being and community vitality and time use and ecological resilience and so on. So it's a very complete matrix that I also describe in the book, with also a statistical tool how to measure that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, and I'm going to come to some questions in a bit here about how you've also done this in business, how you've helped businesses see it from this framework. And but before I go there, I wanted to ask you a question about, because you write about technology in the book, and about different things in terms of how it was supposed to be making us more efficient, things of that nature. And it gave me some good chuckles about, how caught up we are with technology. And I'm not sure if you've heard of this new technology called Chat GPT. Are you familiar with this? And so, I've used this a few times and it kind of blew my mind. Maybe I'm getting old, I don't know, but I'm curious, as this keeps evolving, what are your thoughts on this technology and how we can, best utilize it, because it's here, it's not going to go away, but yet still stay, true to the basics, I guess. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but that's how it works in my mind. So any thoughts you have on that?
I think it's a very interesting question, because when we work in the field of education, it's a very central question, but also in the field of work, it's a very important question. So what is the role of artificial intelligence, and how will the progress in the field of artificial intelligence impact our lives? And I think that, setting aside the fascination that we can have, which I guess was similar to the one our forefathers felt when they first saw the first train rushing through until then they'd been walking or riding horses, and to a train rushing. Wow, it's like unbelievable, that it will change the world forever. Anyway, it did. right? And then even more when the first planes came in and so on and so forth, and the first computers and the first, So it's always the question, technology is, of course, something potentially positive because it's the expression of human intelligence and, our genius as a species to create things that are really amazing. And in the same way that, our machines were able to go much faster than we could run, right? Or the fastest animal could run. And in the same way that, machines could build things much faster than the most skillful worker, in the same way we have developed artificial intelligence machine that can think, or they cannot really think, but that can process information much, much faster than we can. And that's great, because it means, it shows how innovative our species is. Yeah. The question is always, what is it serving? So, because we speak of artificial intelligence, but it's a little bit, I'm not sure if it's the right word, because intelligence includes self-awareness, freedom, decision, values, and so on. And data processing is something a little bit different. So it can mimic intelligence, but it's a little bit different from intelligence. So I think that because this artificial intelligence is really amazing and it's become, one can even, it's hard to imagine how it will be in 10, 20, 30 years, right? But one thing is for sure, it requests that we take even greater care to develop those fundamental human qualities that you cannot expect machines to take over. And so these are things like social and emotional learning, right? So self-knowledge, self-transformation, social awareness, relationship building. We don't want robots to become better at that than friends. We don't want robots to take over friendship and love. Right. They might take many tasks, and maybe it's good if they take it, but certain things have to remain in the human, and the quality of human relationship, and then ethical values and so on. And so I think that because of the very fast development of artificial intelligence, it has become very important to refocus education on those purely human skills that we don't expect machine to replace us. But many things that we use to teach in schools, machines will be much better at it. And so we should refocus so that of course, we still need to train the memory, analytical thinking, and so I'm not saying we should get rid of it, but it's not enough anymore, because that will not be enough to fill the gap between what humans need and what machines can do.
Yeah.
So rethinking education for the 21st century should mean including the challenges of dealing with artificial intelligence in such a way that, again, artificial intelligence is serving happiness and well-being and doesn't replace humans at the center. Right. Now it's a computer at the center because it's so much more intelligent than anybody else.
So you work with something called Happy Schools, and did you found Happy Schools? Yes, that's right. That's what I thought. So you founded Happy Schools. I want to come back to this idea of all these things you were just talking about. So what are Happy Schools, and how does this all fit into the Happy School curriculum?
So Happy School has several roots, if you want. I founded it, but I didn't invent it. It was really bringing together things that were around. So one was, I worked with the Mind and Life Institute, which is based in the US, where His Holiness Dalai Lama has been working with many scientists. And I was part of the group within Mind and Life who developed a curriculum called A Call to Care, where we first introduced these ideas of care in education. And then for several reasons, this program stopped. Then at that time I was in Bhutan, and I worked with the Ministry of Education. The preface of my book is written by the former Minister of Education. So Lepotako, I was working with him, how to implement gross national happiness in schools. So that was the first learning round, trying to reflect. So if we take these concepts of gross national happiness, these values, how do we implement them in schools? So that was our learning ground. And then a bit later, the UNESCO Bureau in Asia published a report called Happy Schools, where they analyzed the educational system in Southeast Asia. And many of these systems are performing very highly in terms of academic achievements. Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and so on. But in terms of well-being of the young people, not so well. And so the UNESCO experts were pointing out to the fact that we cannot equate high academic achievement with well-being. And so they were asking themselves, so what would it need for a school to promote happiness and well-being? So when I read this report and I then went to Bangkok to meet with the expert who had written it, I thought, oh, that's a good entry door, because almost all the countries are part of UNESCO, which is the UN agency that takes care of culture and education. And if it's a recommendation from the UNESCO to pay more attention to the happiness and well-being of the students, it will be easier for ministries to accept that. And so we started a pilot project in Vietnam that was about 5 years ago, because we had good connection there. We had been working in the field of special education, and we did it with the supervision of a university so that we have a third-party assessment. And the idea was to bring what we call happiness skills in the schools. So first one is mindfulness. Because of all the things we've been discussing before, there's a tendency of distraction, too many information, constantly, looking at that screen, and so you cannot take it for granted anymore that students can listen, that they can be concentrated, that they can be fully present. And so the first step was to bring mindfulness in the school, and mindfulness as a basis for emotional learning. So through mindfulness, the students learn to slow down, to look inward, and then they can observe themselves and become aware of their own emotions. And then they notice some emotions are very painful and some are very joyous. And now how do we cultivate consciously positive emotion that will bring happiness and well-being, such as, gratitude, joy, empathy, compassion, kindness? And how do we transform difficult emotions such as jealousy, sadness, depression? So we developed really a curriculum where we first taught the teachers, because the teachers have to embody these. How do you learn to deal with difficult emotions? How do you learn to cultivate positive emotions? That was module 1. Module 2 is, on this basis, how do you create good, lasting relationships that are based on friendship, love, respect, trust, things like that. Social learning. And again, our assumption is that these are skills, therefore they can be trained, right? We all have a natural ability to a certain extent, but it can be further developed. And the third, so that's module 2, caring for others in nature, for others in society. Yeah, and it's about human interaction. And the module 3 is about caring for nature and the planet, because our observation was that you could not simply preach, like, consume less or whatever, if the children don't have a heart connection with the natural world, with animals, with plants, and many kids in the cities don't have that. Right. How can they care for something they don't know, right? So it's really creation, that heart connection with other species, with nature, so that out of that arises care and compassion towards. So this is the fundamental of Happy School, and we've been implementing it in pilot schools in Vietnam, and it's been very, very successful. We have very good results from teachers, from students, and also from parents who just, said, "Wow, it has changed my kid," Mm-hmm. And then came the pandemic. And that was tragic, but also very interesting, because then we saw that the kids who had been going through the Happy School program were much more resilient and could go through the pandemic and the suffering of isolation and so on much stronger than those who hadn't. And that raised a great interest of the Ministry of Education in Vietnam, because mental health of the young people has become a huge issue everywhere, but also in Vietnam. And so now we are in the process of scaling up nationwide the program.
In Vietnam?
In Vietnam, yeah.
And then does Happy Schools, is it anywhere else?
Yeah, we have a Happy School in Switzerland. So it's a more beginning stage. We are more still in the pilot phase in Switzerland, and we also have pilot phase in Germany.
Okay. And on the mindfulness part of it, the self-care, that is a secular practice?
Yes. The whole Happy School is totally secular for several reasons. One, because we are working in different cultural contexts, so it should be culturally, I don't know if neutral is the right way, but acceptable in many different contexts. B, because most of the schools are secular in most countries. And it's also, I totally agree with it. I think it's the right thing, because a school should be able to accommodate children from various cultural and religious backgrounds and should not impose one specific religious or spiritual orientation. So therefore, the whole of the Happy School framework is really based on scientific knowledge, although we do also build on traditional wisdom coming from various traditions, but in as far as we also have scientific evidence. And we have now a lot, especially neuroscience and so on. So that's not a problem. Yeah.
And for preparation for our talk today, I didn't draw on this, but it's just coming to me now. I recall watching a documentary of sorts, I think it was, about the Happy School. I believe it was in Vietnam. And I would like to link that onto the show notes. So I want to make sure I get that. I'm referring, you know what I'm referring to, correct?
Yes, there's a little film called Happy School. Yeah, I can send you.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, it's really good. Really, really good. I'd like to segue now into business. Most of the listeners are in business and entrepreneurs. Many are entrepreneurs. And I'd like to ask you just first, how did this idea of gross national happiness make its way into business? What was the evolution for you as far as how that happened?
So when I was working in Bhutan as a director of the Gross National Happiness Center, we were very aware of the fact that if we don't transform the economy, it will not really be sustainable. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a distorted understanding of economy by and large, which is like economy as the most important part of society, while economy is, of course, important, but serving the needs of the people and not the people serving the economy. So we were aware that we needed to find entrepreneurs and business people who were willing to try to do this shift. And of course, we have many examples, not necessarily out of GNH, but, like with B Corps, with, several initiatives, right. So we're not alone on that. But our idea was really, is it possible to implement the values, the framework, and the methodology of gross national happiness in the business world? And in Bhutan, it was very difficult to do because the business sector in Bhutan is very small. It's a small country that we didn't have a lot of big companies. And so the first attempt was done in Thailand. We had a partner in Thailand, which is a large energy company, BGRIM. And they were interested in trying that out. So they were the very first ones to implement gross national happiness in their company. And so the idea was to, as I said, the whole idea of gross national happiness is built on these two aspects of happiness. One is the inner transformation, like we've discussed about education. And the other one is the structural transformation, system transformation. And the idea is if you can match inner transformation and social or structural transformation, then you have something that is sustainable, because obviously the two are constantly interacting. People are creating systems, but systems are conditioning people. So, you have to either you have a vicious circle that unhealthy system creates like negative mindset that reinforces the negative system, or you have a virtuous circle, and that's what we're trying to build. So we were working on two dimensions. One was working really with the management and with the employees to develop a inner culture, right, of happiness and well-being, with happiness skills similar to what we do in the schools, but at the same time also looking at the systemic dimension of the company, like the, like HR system, reporting system, marketing, and so on, really all looking at all the system and transforming them in the perspective of cross-national happiness, starting with redefining the vision and the mission, redefining the values, and then the behaviors that would be aligned with these values, so that we have something consistent that goes from top down and bottom up. And it was quite successful with Big Rim, and Big Rim is also financially very successful company. And then building on that, we developed several other experiences. Obviously of BTS, because you also interviewed the CEO of BTS, this large
Cindy Vu,
Cindy Vu, who has a large company with 10,000 employees. And she's the first GNH certified company in Vietnam, And with them, what we saw again during the pandemic was that the fact that they had gone through this process before the pandemic gave them a much stronger resilience during the pandemic, so that they were really able to survive very well, and not only survive as a company, but make a lot of very positive contribution to society in a time where their company was really fragile. But, their attitude was so positive, so generous, and now they are reaping the fruits, because society knows, wow, that's a company you can trust. These people are there for us, not just to make money, So, and now we're also working with companies in Switzerland, in Austria, and so far my experience is that it's been working very well for several reasons. One, because we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that, who wants to go in Monday morning to an office to do something that is meaningless just to make a bit of, but you have to pay your bills. Okay, so you do it, but it's not really inspiring if you don't, if you couldn't put your heart into it. When a company becomes a GNH company, it becomes a much more meaningful work environment, where the people have the feeling we're not only producing shoes or electricity or whatever it is they're producing and making benefit, but we're also contributing to society. Mm-hmm. It gives a meaningfulness. And the work atmosphere, the work culture is so much better, because it's a management based on values. Mm-hmm. Management based on trust, on compassion, on kindness, and therefore, and you're a businessman yourself, and you know how it is. Employee engagement is one of the big issues in any company. So if you manage to have a company with strong employee engagement, I mean that's a big contributor to the success of the company.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure this may run the gamut, but how long does it take to go through a process like this to get it going, and where the employees begin to feel the impact, and that it isn't a flavor of the day from the CEO who saw something shiny and decided to implement it?
So there's two sides to it. The full process takes about 3 years, so it's relatively long, and takes a lot of commitment and a lot of courage, because you are using a lot of resource, especially time resources, not so much money, but it's right. A lot of time. But ideally, the fruits can be perceived quite soon. So, for instance, if we take the case of BTS, the shoe company in Vietnam, what Cindy, the CEO, did, and that I thought was really very clever, we did a survey of their company with the GNH index. So that's the starting point normally. And then we saw where there were domains that were hurting, that were difficult. And right away, she introduced a specific project for these domains. Let me give you two examples. One example was education. A lot of their employees are young women, many of them young mothers. And many of these young mothers are a little bit lost, because they moved from living in the countryside, where education was a village thing, to in the city, best case scenario, father, mother, and 1 or 2 kids, oftentimes also mother alone with kids. So education was really an issue. So we offered educational workshops for the workers within working hours, and they were free to join these workshops. And then, where we gave very practical advice, how to better deal with the problems that they were facing on a daily basis. That was one. Another one was about physical health, because they work on a how do you call that? Where things
assembly line.
Assembly line, right? So it's very tiring to work on assembly line. And so many had like back pains, so there was a program with traditional medicine, Vietnamese traditional medicine, like movements and acupuncture, massage, where the employees got that for free and could, and improved, and many little programs like that. They were not yet big GNH things, but taking the domains of GNH, and so that really the frontline employee, not the high managers, whatever, really the basic people could experience, the company cares for our well-being and does something practical for our well-being. So then when we came and spoke about happiness and well-being in the company, it's not just a floating idea, very abstract, but it's, yes, I remember I did the workshop for my physical health, for my education, for how do I deal with my money and things like that.
Right.
That within a few months, there was already an experience that, it's a serious thing.
And I should say I have personal experience with this. You shared some information with me a couple of years ago, and we took what was a 20-question survey, and I don't know how many questions now, but it's quite extensive, utilizing the GNH framework. And what I'll say it did for us is it, similar to what you were just saying, is it shined a light in certain areas where we could even do what might be seen as little things. In many ways, they actually are big, but they're little. And it's a little thing here and a little thing there that improve the wellness of a person or the mindset of a person or, the holistic aspect of a person. And so I'm here to say, in a little company, Cindy has 10,000 employees. We have 70. This can be quite impactful as well. In addition to that, what I learned may be different from Cindy or not, I'm not sure, is that people were very curious about these questions we were all of a sudden asking. And I think overall, they began to understand we wanted to go deeper and help understand at a deeper level what the real issues were beyond these 20 kind of basic questions we were asking. So we could determine how we could really make an impact. So I'm here to say it's quite impactful. So thank you for that.
Thank you for sharing.
Yes, absolutely. I want to ask just a couple more questions from you. The first is about gratitude. And I want to ask you, why that's hard for so many people. And if you find that to be the experience, I find that to be when I share with people the power of gratitude. And I hear people often respond by saying, I need to do that more. And I always laugh. What does that mean, do that more? So what do you think it is? And do you have any wisdom around that?
So my own discovery of gratitude really went through the meeting with a very dear friend of mine, whose brother David Standel Rast.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
He was kind enough to write also a blurb for my book. So he's a Benedictine monk, Austrian, and he's in 95 or something. And I traveled with him through Bhutan. And traveling through Bhutan, for those who have done it, is quite tough because the roads are very bad. And you have roadblocks. I mean, it's hard. I mean, a lot of people lose their patience, right?
Uh-huh.
And Brother David, I was amazed. He was, at that time, he was 89 or 90, so already very old.
Wow.
We were traveling like hours on end. And then the minibus had to stop because there was a boulder on the road, and we had no idea how long we would have to stay. And most people, got impatient and sort of. And Brother David was always there. He said, "Oh, what a good opportunity! Now we can, walk and look at the landscape, and and so I really experienced with him. Whatever happened, he always felt grateful for what was happening,
mm-hmm.
and saw it as an opportunity. And each time this happened, he would walk out of the bus and take a few steps. And then right away, like out of nowhere, you had 10, 20 kids around him. He was like a magnet for children, because he was shining something so kind. So, for me, Brother David, is embodied gratitude. And when you experience that, you realize that this inner attitude of being grateful for what is, not only for the good thing, just for what is, like a fundamental gratitude, just, wow, I mean, look, Rob, we're alive. How amazing. We are like thousands of miles apart. We can speak with one another. How amazing.
Unbelievable.
So every minute we can find endless reason for gratitude, as well as you could find endless reason to be upset. Like, hey, how come we've never met physically? How frustrating is that?
Right.
So you realize when you practice it as a conscious intention, it just transforms your life from something, it really makes life so much lighter and so much fun and so much more pleasant,
Yes.
And simple exercises like waking up in the morning and saying, okay, what, let me have 3 thoughts of something I'm grateful for. I slept in a warm bed, and that was,
simple as that.
And I wake up and nothing hurts. I'm quite well, and I can go down and make myself a good cup of coffee, or whatever you drink in the morning, and just enjoy that, And then likewise in the evening before falling asleep, just 3 things that were just so amazing today. Here today, I have amazing sunshine. I just went for a walk before I spoke with you.
Good.
It was so beautiful. Now we're having this beautiful conversation, and we could go on and on. So gratitude is really one of the keys to happiness.
Yeah, and I love the way you frame it in terms of the simplicity of things, because sometimes we lose sight of that. So thank you for that. Tho, is there anything that I missed? Is there anything that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Well, I think we had quite an extensive conversation. I don't want to, overburden the poor listeners. I don't want over an hour or a good hour. I mean, I enjoy so much speaking with you, and you're listening so well. We could go on for hours.
We could.
Asking a bit much for the people who will be watching our video. So I think that's good enough.
Perfect. And you're so right. I have to temper myself so I don't get off on tangents, or else the poor listeners, they'd be 3 hours in, and then I'd be taking up too much of your time. But Tho, I am so grateful to you in so many ways, as the audience doesn't know, but you've had such a wonderful impact on my life, and I want to share that with you. Thank you for everything that you've taught me, and the little things and the big things. And I'm just so grateful that somehow I had the opportunity to have you in my life, and it's just very special. So thank you so much for that. You are really one wonderful, wonderful person, and I have a lot of love for you. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Absolutely.
Yeah, our meeting has been a blessing.
Oh, thank you. And to all the wonderful listeners, I greatly appreciate you spending time. Your time's incredibly valuable, and I respect it greatly. So I hope you enjoyed our conversation today, and I wish you all much love and gratitude.